As international educators, like so many others, in a sense, we tend to write chapters to our life stories. These stories can be organized by countries, schools, travel, and, of course, the regular categories of relationships, family, children, aging, and so on. We were fortunate to catch up with our guest, Mark Lewis, just as he is reflecting about the chapters of his international experiences with his retirement coming up in a couple of months. With Mark's soon to be retired status, we asked him the guiding question: what are some of your lessons learned from the various roles you experienced during your years of going global? With such a long career in international schooling, Mark had a lot of gems to share with us. Here are a few. Commonalities of international schools in Asia, characteristics of international schools specifically in China, clarifications between legacy international schools, bilingual schools, and local student majority schools, a look at for-profit schools and the various forms they can take, working with school boards, leaky boundaries in international schools, repatriating to one's home country, and a rapid-fire sharing of lessons learned from Mark's career overseas. Check out our show notes to learn more about Mark's long international administrative career. Also visit the Educators Going Global Stories section of our information hub to watch Mark's Going Global stories. This episode was recorded on March 23, 2025. We now give you the well-traveled and experienced Mark Lewis, who in our eyes has written a remarkable career in international education.
Hey, Mark, it's great to see you. How are you?
I'm great, and it's just fantastic to reconnect again with, people that you've worked with internationally were so important to you when you're in, another country, and you just really connect with them. And so it's just wonderful to reconnect again because we have spent some incredible time and memories together. So wonderful to reconnect again this way.
Yeah, back in the Riyadh days when at least you and I, Mark, were neighbors and David was not far away. So good times. So where in the world are you now?
So I am now in Lac-La-Hache, British Columbia, Canada, which is about as different as I could experience from my international career. I'm in a town here. I think it has maybe 500 people at the most. And we have a little house here on the lake. I see some people out there ice fishing, and it's wonderful. It's nice to be back in Canada in such a different setting. But I do say one of the hard parts is that, locals will say, oh, so where do you live? Lac-La-Hache. Where were you before? China. Well, the conversation just kind of stops. It's like, oh, was interesting, but nowhere to connect. So I kind of hide that around here. I try to blend in be as local as I can and try to make it seem like I'm from Lac-La-Hache.
Oh, yeah. We get that, don't we, David? All right. So back to the international world. Do you have a going global story that you'd like to share with us?
Well, there's so many because that's one of the reasons why we go overseas is for the adventures and for the weirdness that happens. But the one that I remember that just comes to mind, I think, is the one that's with you, David. I remember, I think it was a spring break. It was in Shanghai. You were in Shanghai. And as we do when we get together with old friends from previous schools we were at, we start asking about different colleagues that we had worked with. And do you know what this guy's doing now? Or do you remember what this couple's doing now? And trying to catch up. Because, when you're overseas, these people that you're living with in these foreign countries are just so important to you. And then you move away someplace, but that doesn't stop them from still having incredibly important memories with them. So it was just wonderful to sit and catch up and find out where everybody's at. And I remember at one point we got around and David, you're saying, oh yeah, and you remember Don and Charlotte Zimbrick when we worked with them in Riyadh. And I was like, oh yeah, they were fantastic. And in fact, they're just coming through the door behind you right now.
I love that.
And you had a look on your face like I would never forget. It was just shock and surprise, like you wouldn't believe. You turned around, and sure enough, they were right there. And you were like, well, how are they right here? Well, as it turned out, their daughter worked at the school that I was a principal at, and they were there visiting her at that particular time and came through the door. And you got a chance then to kind of catch up with Don and Charlotte just as you spoke to them. It's like we say, in the international community, 6 degrees is probably too much. It doesn't take too much before people can start connecting with each other. And so that was a neat moment.
You manifested them, David. What power.
And I'll share Don Zimbrick. He's sadly no longer with us. He was one of those big personalities that you meet in your overseas travels that sticks with you wherever you go. And Don and I used to have conversations about everything in the world. And one of the things that Don taught me, I was a counselor then, but also a history teacher, was the acronym SPRAT plus G. And it's a framework for teaching social studies that deals with economics, religion, arts, geography. You can figure out the other parts of that acronym. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes. It's a wonderful framework for social studies teachers. So that was a lifelong takeaway that Don shared with me. Lots of good memories and conversations with Don. So let's continue our conversation with our guiding question. Now that you are winding up your career, you've shared with us that you're going to retire not too long in the future. So looking back, what are some of your lessons that you've learned from the many roles that you've experienced during your years of going global? So big, broad question. Let's break it down and start with Asia, where all three of us have spent a lot of time. What are some trends that you picked up on? We know generalizations, we have to be careful, but boy, a lot of the themes really are true when you've worked in as many places that we've worked in. So, what are some commonalities from your experiences of working in international schools in Asia?
Well, I think the first one that comes to mind is that the American education has really high value currency in all the Asian different posts that I had. I think that it was seen that if their children could get an American education, that would open up all kinds of avenues and doors for them if they could, not only speak English, but also maybe able to have an American education that they could maybe then get into an American college or university and get a really good education. They really highly valued American education and Western ones, because some of them would go to Canada as well. And if they could get that Western degree, then that would just seem as just it would be opening all kinds of doors for them. So the American education kind of was more of a door to get to an American college or university. It was really highly valued.
So, when it comes to families, one of the things I talk about a lot is just how supportive in general families are. And in many ways, like even now as a retired person, when I'll mention to someone in Thailand or I'll be in Vietnam, there's just a sense of respect for educators. That was another theme that I ran across. And then there's the theme of whole family support from grandparents through the parents, of course. And then the sense that in this part of the world, it might have only been a generation or two since these families have come out of poverty, and that they're so willing to put a lot of money on the line to move those grandchildren, those children to have a more prosperous life. So that's one of the themes I wanted to mention as well.
No, you're right. That whole sense of respect is one of the things, it's just different now that I'm teaching in the public sector back here in Canada. I really like how you mentioned that, because over there, I'd sit down with parents and there was a real sense of them saying, thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching my son or daughter. And I really see you as being able to open up some great avenues for them. And it was nice being able to have that sort of sense of value with these families. It was great. So that was one of the great things about being at international schools is it was a lot of respect, admiration, thankfulness, and that just helped to make working there just a joy. There's lots of great things, but there is a shadow side. You can imagine being a 16, 17-year-old kid and your family, whether they're wealthy or not, just putting so much expectations on you to be able to get that American education and be able to get to a college and university and to open all kinds of doors for you, and maybe for the family, maybe for the family business. There's a lot of pressure on a lot of these kids. And so it wasn't uncommon in a lot of my experiences for kids to have 95% in one of their subjects and to come up to their teacher and saying, what can I do to get this higher? And it's just, look at, you're a kid who's taking an AP course, a college level course in your second language, and you're getting 95%. You should be thrilled. Everybody should be so happy for you. It's just, that's incredible. I mean, and if you sent me to Korea and had me to take some course in Korea, I would just bomb. I mean, I wouldn't even come close to what you're doing. But just that pressure to get the highest percentage possible. One of the schools I was at, one of the graduation requirements was to have 4 AP courses done by the time you're in grade 11. Because if you had those 4 AP courses, then when you went to apply for these colleges and universities, that was a great way to boost your application. But at this particular school I was at, very few kids had 4 APs. It was more. And some of the kids, by the time they finished grade 11, some of them had up to 12 AP courses.
That's insane.
Yeah. And these kids worked so hard just so they could have a really attractive looking package that they could send to these colleges and universities. And some of these kids were just amazing. I remember one girl at one of the last schools I was at, I saw her at a theatrical performance of Aladdin. She played Jasmine, and she was just incredible. She could sing, she could act, she just carried the show. And I thought, okay, so here's a thespian, that's her thing. The next day I went in and she was in a calculus BC class and just was smoking it. She was just one of these unusual students who could just do everything. But then you get some kids who, there's a lot that were just really, really good students, but to get the same kind of level as this girl could. And it was just, I knew some of them, the pressure was too much. It was too hard. And they were, doing fantastic and just taking courses in second language that were really hard. But they might have got 85%, which is incredible, but they weren't happy with that. And that was sad because if I got 85% in a Korean math course, boy, I would be taking myself out for dinner.
Maybe 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it just speaks to the differences in values in different places. I know you've said to us before off mic that, there's a saying that a Western B, even a high B, B plus is equivalent to an Asian F as the parents see it and the kids. And so they really get upset, even though we look at it and say, you're lying, you're crushing it. So let's pivot into talking specifically about China, because you spent a fair bit of time there. So, what are your observations about international education in China?
So I think in China that there's a lot more organizations. So we're kind of getting into the privately owned or board owned schools there. And it feels to me that there are a lot more organizations that are taking a look at international schools as a great money making venture. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. You need money to be able to afford schools. But I know one of the schools I was at had an owner. I think he had some funding from some pretty major Chinese corporations because they were building lots of schools all over the place. And I had a meeting with him once, and through the translator, I said, so why is it that you're starting all these schools in China? And he gave the answer that I suspected at the beginning. He said, I really want to provide Chinese students with quality education, and I really believe in the program that we're providing for them. I think it's a good fit. And then he kind of had a smile on his face, and he kind of said, but if I was being honest, the real reason is I can see a place here where we can make a lot of money. So I do worry that there's a lot of recruiting agencies, a lot of schools popping up in China that are privately owned. And I'm sure they want to provide a good education as well. But I am a little bit worried that some of them are there because it's a good business model.
Yeah, we had a conversation with Dave McMaster, who is currently head of school in Bahrain,
Hmm.
American School of Bahrain, and he mentioned that as well. And one thing that he highlighted was, as someone recruiting as a head of school, particularly, but comes down to teachers as well, that it's important to do your research and do your best to figure out what is the angle of the people that own the school. And if it is a corporate type school, a for profit school, do they also value education and to what degree? So, I don't know how to determine that, quite honestly. Maybe you have some suggestions around that, but do your research the best you can.
For sure. I think you start with the mission statement. Take a look at the mission statement and say, can you give me some examples of how your school supports your mission statement? And if it's just kind of a token mission statement to make it, because they should have one and it sounds good, they might struggle with that question. But a good school, I think, would be able to say, our mission statement is this, and here are 3 ways that we're working on that right now. So I'm sure there's lots of different ways. That's what comes to mind for me right now, what I would try.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's always places like International School Community and International School Reviews. So there are other ways. You're right.
With folks just coming overseas, I think I can say this. It's true that China is the largest international school market. And whether they're bilingual schools, whether they're a school that's totally for local kids in English, but it is the biggest market. And just what you two are saying is really do your research, find those avenues, as Audrey was saying, because this is a great place to get your start. It's a super competitive world out there trying to get jobs internationally, and China's the biggest market, so don't write it off. There are a lot of wonderful schools and places to go there, that's for sure. So, to my point, there's just so many different formats for various schools, and one of the formats are schools that are designed primarily for local students. So there's that format, and it can be totally in English. And then we can shift a little bit to bilingual schools where it's a local student majority. So the language would be potentially English and whatever that home country language is. So, Mark, can you speak to both of those bilingual schools and schools that are really for the local kids totally, but in English, maybe not bilingual?
So I think I could talk about 3 different kinds of schools that I'm familiar with. So one of them is just called international schools, and that's where they'll have international students, and they'll probably have some local kids mixed in there as well that come there. I know in Vietnam, one of the international schools, they had a 30% cap on local kids, though, because they wanted to keep it international. And there's so many locals, they could have had it be higher than that. So they wanted to keep the demographics very international. So number 1 is an international school where some of the local kids also attend. Number 2 is the kind of school that is kind of only for local kids. One of the schools I was at in Vietnam, only local kids attended that school. And that was really fun and interesting and different because we were able to really focus on a lot of the Vietnamese culture and just really honor the Vietnamese way of doing things and meld it really well with the American way were used to doing things. And it was really neat. I really liked it. But that shouldn't be confused with the bilingual schools. So there's a lot of bilingual schools, and these, from my experience, this is my understanding, is that to get into an international school in China, you have to have a foreign passport. And so it's very common, in my experience, for a lot of the students to have African passports. So I think there's a whole sub business out there where if you're Chinese and you can afford it, you can get a passport from Africa. So you have a second passport, and that gives you access then to go to an international school. You can't go there with strictly a Chinese passport, which kind of is, when you think about it, okay, so we're going to start an international school in China, and here's the qualifications for kids to be able to get in. You have to have a foreign passport. Your English language proficiency has to be high enough so that you can access the American curriculum without any translation. It's just going to come the way it does. And you also have to be academically prepared and able to do advanced placement courses by the time you hit high school. So if you told me that you had to have those criteria to get into an international school, well, maybe you get 20 kids, but you're not. You're getting hundreds of kids that are able to meet that criteria. It's just amazing to me. So then the bilingual schools are different. These are mostly for students who are not able, for whatever reason, to have that foreign passport. But these companies are still seeing that they want to be able to provide what they consider an international or an American curriculum for these students. But they can't call it international because it's not strictly an American curriculum. So they're called bilingual schools. And they quite often will promise them and say, but they're still getting the same curriculum as these international schools. You still can get into American colleges and universities. My experience, though, is that they're very different. So if you're a new teacher and you're going to a bilingual school, you're kind of teaching more like an ESL teacher. These kids are not going to be as proficient. And the other part is, by law, they also have to have the Chinese curriculum. So their English isn't as proficient, and they're supposed to cover the Chinese and the American curriculum at the same time. So there's a lot of pressure on bilingual school students and teachers to be able to satisfy all that. One of the last things that I did when I was in China, I was working with bilingual schools, and rather than teach like the Chinese curriculum and then the American curriculum, I said, hold it, let's see if we can't get some overlap so we can teach one thing that satisfies both the Chinese curriculum and the American curriculum. And when I went into that experience, I thought they're just going to be so divergent. There's going to be very little overlap because my bias was, I'm sure the Chinese curriculum is all knowledge-based kind of thing. I was really pleasantly surprised. The Chinese curriculum, in my viewpoint, was really quite good, and we found lots of overlap. So which I think really helped teachers then to say, look, I could teach this one thing and know that I'm covering both curriculums rather than have them quite so separate. But bilingual schools, I think, if you're a new teacher, you know you're going to be teaching mostly ESL students and mostly know that somehow you're going to have to try satisfying that national curriculum as well.
And let me dovetail on a couple of those things because you've brought up two topics that, Audrey, I think we need to do shows on. One are multilingual learners and how are schools working to support them. And one of the things, as you were just saying, if you've got a school that's going to be leading kids into higher level learning, IB or AP or something similar, those kids definitely have to have the English down. So when schools open up their middle school or maybe 9th or 10th grade to new students, local students who are not native English speakers, that takes a lot of work. And I wonder how many schools out there don't do a good job at really raising those English levels so the kids are successful. Back to the point of all the pressure. Lots of pressure on the kids, but do they have the toolkits to be able to handle that with their language? So that's a whole topic.
If I could just add to that, that was my experience when I came back to Canada and taught at North Van. It was at Bodwell High School. They had ESL classes, and it was on a trimester system. So they said you could take ESL for 3 trimesters and then go into the regular program, and then you could get a Dogwood certificate, which is a grade 12 graduation. And it was just a lie, You can't learn English in a year to be able to do well enough at the curriculum. So these kids were like writing English 11, English 12 finals and getting 50%. And I thought, that's pretty good after 1 year of ESL. It's not long enough to learn a language.
Well, thanks for validating that because that has been a fear of mine. So the second one you brought up, it just turns out that Dr. Jim Rees, who we're going to have on very soon, is in China right now working with a bilingual school on melding their IB and Chinese curriculum. So that's another topic that we're going to hit on going forward.
Yeah, well, I think that's so important. Because as you said, China has a huge international school market right now. So if somebody can find a way that melds the Chinese curriculum with IB, wow, that's going to be gold.
Well, you did make it sound like maybe there are more similarities than we really anticipated, so that's a good thing. We could probably talk about China for a lot longer, but we'd like to maybe broaden our scope again. What challenges, opportunities, and trends going forward do you see in the running of international schools in a more general sense?
I think you got to have a clear mission for the schools and the boards that have there. And I think that the competition to get students is very strong. And I worry that some of the schools are kind of looking around and saying, what can we say or do that will attract students to come to our school? Rather than saying, here's the mission we stand on, and we don't care if we have 20 kids, this is the mission that we want, and this is how we're going to do it. Rather, it's kind of the other way around. It's like, what do we need to say or do to try to get people to come to our school? And one of the things, I think IB is a wonderful program. It's incredible. But I do think that there are some schools who see that as kind of their marketing strategy of getting kids to the school. We're an IB school. And I don't know that they have properly trained their educators or properly understand what you need to support an IB program. It's a fantastic program, but you've got to be all in and you've got to be really, really well prepared. So it's one of the ones that worries me. I do worry about grit. I think that they're trying to get so many different kids, and I don't think it's a good fit for all kids. I worry about that, and that they're trying to get kids, this is the way to go. And luckily, maybe there's some more choices to go from, but, I just don't think that been in some international schools, and it looks like it's just not a good fit for the kids. They just don't have maybe they started late, or maybe they just don't have the kind of grit. They're just like, I'm really good at other things, but this whole international school thing with such a focus on academics really isn't such a great fit for me. So I guess I'm looking for international schools to really focus on having a good mission statement, to be able to say, here's the kind of school we are, here's what we're going to be able to offer to students, and really stick with that mission statement to drive what they're about.
And now we're going to pause for a moment
to share a special message.
Hello, listeners. We are so happy and grateful that you're here with us. And now, for a minute, we're going to get real.
Our mission, as you probably know, is to inform aspiring and existing international educators about the nature of this wonderful lifestyle. For 3 years now, we've worked hard to live up to that mission. We spend hours creating content, liaising with guests, and editing these shows for broadcast. As you know, we love providing this public service, and it helps us tick all of our personal PERMA boxes.
For sure. But here's something a lot of you may not know. We're actually paying out of our own pockets to do this. It costs money to record and host our shows and to run our website. So we're here to ask you a favor.
We are. Would you kindly consider sponsoring us through Patreon? For less than the cost of a cup of coffee per month, you could be helping us break even in terms of these costs. If you feel you're getting value from these shows and from our information hub, and if you can afford it, please go to www.patreon.com/educatorsgoingglobal, and we'll have that link in our show notes to make it easy for you.
We have a couple tiers for your effort to support us. Tier 1 is experience, and there you're just giving us money to support us. And tier 2 is exploration, the chance to join live Q&As with experts.
You gotta love that little bit of punning on the EGG. Thanks once again, honestly, for your interest in traveling, teaching, and connecting with us.
And now, back to our regular programming.
Let's go.
Thank you for that, Mark. And one of the things in looking at trends are the growth of international schools and bilingual schools. And I guess maybe the naming organizations are calling bilingual schools international schools, but as you've described, there's a definite difference. And then the schools that are definitely for the host country population only. So that was very helpful. So let's unpack as best we can the profit versus not-for-profit schools and how they fall into various categories, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I think you have the kind of founding original schools. And when I was recruiting, those always felt like the safest schools. Those felt to me that they had board of directors that had grown up and were matured and really were there because their origins or genesis was to provide a good education for the people that were living there, quite often expats. And so they had grown up. So that seemed like the safest place to go. And then all of a sudden, there's a lot more profit schools. And I think, a lot of people said, oh, be careful. They're just out to make money. And I think that that's too easy. I think there's some profit schools to avoid. And I think there's some that have really built themselves on a good model. So I worked for one international school that was owned by an owner. And I think he really saw this as kind of being a legacy for him, being able to say, wow, look what I was able to start a school. And he felt very proud of it. It was his school. And, it had done extremely well. And some graduates had done very well. And he should have felt very proud of it. The limiting factor is that it was his perspective and his way of doing things. And so I think that if you're going to work at a school that has one owner, then there's a lot of power in that one vision that they have. And then there's some other profit schools that are part of a larger organization, I think like GEMS, some of the Dulwich schools. And I think, one of the advantages of those kind of schools is that they have really kind of worked on founding a model. And there's a lot of people who have worked on that model and kind of have said, here's the kind of school that we're trying to do. And they've kind of replicated that in different places. So it looks to me like some of those really work. And the other advantage, of course, is quite often some of those will advertise and say, look, if you work at this school here in Bangkok and it goes well, and after a few more years you want to go to another school, and we happen to have another school in Singapore, then you could just kind of transfer over to Singapore to that school. So I've worked at those kind of schools. They're owned by Cognita, and it was kind of a lot of great experiences. It was a British-owned company, so we would have these meetings once a year in England and go fly there and meet with English educators, and some were from South America. So there's those ones. And then I think you have other ones that are a bit more corporate-based, where a corporation has kind of got an international school, so a lot of their kids have a place to go to school, and that's very much tied with the corporation. Aramco would be an example of that in Saudi Arabia. Those are some of the ones that I can think of. There's also just international schools that just an organization has started it, and probably because they see it as a good money maker.
So when you talk about looking at who owns the school, who runs the school, who manages the school, really we're talking about governance. And one thing that is important to understand is what is the makeup of the school board, if there even is a school board, and how can you work well together? So maybe you can address that a little bit for us.
Well, I remember I went to a conference on governance, and Littleford, anyway, he was kind of a world expert on it. And he basically said that the board of directors or the governing body should do three things only. And this is their job. Their first job is to make sure that the school is being fiscally responsible. So are they spending money on what they should be spending money on? Are they intaking money enough so that they can support the school? So someone's got to look over the big financial picture, and that should be the governing body. Number two is the superintendent is ultimately in charge, or the head of school, ultimately in charge for the education of that school. They're brought in to be the expert to make sure that education is done well. But the superintendent needs somebody to hold them accountable. And so that's the second role of the governance, is to say, here's the mission of the school. We've hired you to help promote the mission of the school, and we're going to hold you accountable to that. So that's number two. That's the second thing that governing body should be doing. And number three is holding the school accountable to the overall mission statement. So whatever their mission statement is the school aligned with what they're doing to that mission statement? And if not, they're the ones who should say, hold it. I remember when we were in Saudi, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there was one of the board members who wanted to build a mosque on campus. And luckily, there was a very strong chairman who said, I understand why you'd like to have a mosque, but it doesn't align with what our mission statement is. And so we're not going to be able to do that. So those three things. Governing bodies should make sure that the school's being fiscally responsible. They're the superintendent's boss, and also making sure that the school overall is aligned with the mission statement. And if they're doing those three things well, then they're doing their job. But if they're starting to kind of micromanage or kind of think they've got power in other ways, that can be dangerous for a school because that's not the governing body's job.
So, Mark, let me bring up a topic that came off mic, and I like the terminology leaky boundaries with the board, but I want to expand that. So, whether it's for profit, not for profit, whatever format the school is following, one of the things that educators appreciate are strong boundaries with the parents. Because if you're a school, kind of what you were saying earlier, that's really trying to bring people in and they're kind of bending on their principles and things like that, that can carry over to sometimes giving parents or board members too much influence. So that's one thing, if you could speak to that, just the idea of boundaries between the school and the parents, and also the boundaries between the school and the board that they can't micromanage. So if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Well, let me tell you two stories that what you just said reminded me of, if I could just tell that. So the first story was when I was in a school in China. We had 6 different sections of grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8. And so there's quite a few choices of teachers you could get. And so, different teachers get different reputations. And, some are like, oh, this is a good teacher, or this is a fun teacher or something. And I remember every year, it wouldn't be uncommon for me to have parents come in and say, my son's going to grade 6 next year. I'd sure love for him to have, Mr. Humphrey. It'd be great. And I always gave them the same talk. I always said, I'm sorry, all of our teachers are good teachers. We all are teaching the same curriculum. We all provide common experiences for our kids in different ways. And so thank you for the information, but placing your student in a particular class is not something that I can do. So I would give them that talk. And I remember one man in particular, he had 6 kids who went to the school. So, we're talking almost $200,000 every year that he would put toward the school. So I'd give him the same speech as well. I'm sorry, we can't place children in particular. But I will tell you, boy, did I listen hard to what it was they were looking for in a type of teacher. Oh, we really like traditional type teachers. Okay, traditional type teachers, Mr. Seabrook's a little bit more like that. And so I would give them the speech, but I would certainly listen because, you can save yourself a lot of hassle by getting fit as good as you can. So when I think about leaky boundaries, I think it's really important with parents that they can't get a sense that they can pick and choose which teachers they want. My second story, for whatever reason, we had incredible substitute teachers at this one school when I was in Shanghai. We had people who were lawyers. We had people who were ex-teachers. We had an incredible substitute list. They were just like, we could have started an international school just with teachers who wanted to be in the substitute list. And there's one woman named Rose. We just got along really well. She was just one wise old owl. And we did a training session for substitute teachers. And I remember I said, Rose, I'm going to put you on the spot. We're going to do a little scenario here. And she didn't know this was coming. But I said, let's do a simulation. Rose, I'm going to be a parent who meets you at a party, some expat party. So I said, oh, hi, Rose. How are you? I'm Johnny's dad in grade 5. Johnny's going to be going into grade 6 next year. And you teach a lot at this school as a substitute. Can you tell me which teacher would be the best? And so Rose didn't know that was coming, but she handled it perfectly. She said, in character, she said, oh, I'm sorry. All the teachers are great. They're wonderful. You're at a really good school and they all collaborate together. So she gave the perfect answer because she was such a wise teacher. But, there is a lot of those kind of pressures of parents wanting to get kids into certain places at the school, and they feel somewhat entitled because, they're paying $30,000, $40,000. So having those leaky boundaries in that way certainly is something that you've got to deal with at schools.
All right, let's now shift, and we did a whole show on this repatriating to one's home country. But let's talk about your experience leaving the international education world and returning to Canada. What was that like?
Well, a couple of things that come to mind. The first one was, we talked about that earlier, just the kind of respect that you get being a teacher. You felt valued all the time, and it manifested itself in many different ways. And sometimes it's hard being back in the public sector where you'll get parents coming back and saying, I'm paying my taxes and my kid's not happy and it's your fault. It's like, well, there's a little bit more behind that right now. but it just doesn't feel like it's just a different relationship. And we still need to work with it and still need to educate each other. And I still need to learn from families. But the first few steps feel more adversarial than respectful from what I had at international schools. So that took me a little while to get used to. I guess the second one that really stands out for me, and I was a little bit surprised about this when I went into international school, is just the lack of support there was outside the classroom in a lot of ways. And I think probably the biggest one that comes to mind is the curriculum. So I remember being at different international schools and all of a sudden kind of looking at the curriculum and going, where did this come from? And it's kind of doesn't seem like nearly as good as the curriculum I was working with. And it was like, well, let's change it. Let's have a review. So quite a few of the schools would have like a 4 or 5 year review of their curriculum. And then the teachers would get together with administrators and they'd build a curriculum. Well, my experience is that a lot of teachers are really good at delivering curriculum, but not always very good at building curriculum. So one of the things I've learned as I'm back here in the public system is our curriculum is terrific, and it's made up by some of the people I know that have built it are really outstanding educators. And it's done really, really thoughtfully with a really good process. And so I really value the curriculum that I'm getting a chance to deliver here. And it's not just kind of being made up. And also, the suitcase curriculum is certainly a thing in international schools. Different teachers coming in. I don't care what the curriculum is here. Here's what I taught at my last school, and it worked there, so I'm going to teach it here too. And, no one complains, and they're good. They probably get away with it. But then there's also all kinds of other support that we have. There's the whole mental health thing. There's a lot of support for different mental health initiatives. There's a whole outdoor education support system here for kids who want to do some more outdoor education. There's IT resources you can pull in from the district that will come and help you with different IT things that you want. There's special education specialists that will come and help you with, working with kids who have special needs in different ways. So there's just so much more support for inclusive education. And I think international schools are getting better at it, thanks to the work of Senya and that whole organization especially. But I'm sure there's still a lot of international schools who say a kid comes, starts, struggles, this isn't a good fit, and out they go. Where in public education, you don't do that. You're like, okay, let's keep trying to find something that we can help. So the good part of it is the kids I teach now are very inclusive and really the best professional development I could have as an educator, trying to meet all the different needs of all the different students. The hard part is that there's a lot of different needs, and it's hard to meet all the needs of different students. Whereas at international school, the band was quite a bit more narrow, and there was kind of an expectation that you could teach within that narrow band, and the students were kind of expected to fall within that band, and if they didn't, then it was probably seen as not a good fit for the school.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I love how you've compared and contrasted the two. It's not all fun and games on either side of that. There's great things and more challenging things on either side. So thank you for that. So let's just talk a little bit about winding down your career as well. What do you have to say about how that went for you? And do you have any tips for people as they kind of wind down and maybe repatriate?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed coming back. And, one of the things that I've always felt really strongly about is I think that sometimes expats have got a bit of a bad name, that I think some people have kind of looked at them and say, so what's wrong with our country? Like, why did you go overseas? Like, what's the matter with America? Or what's the matter with Canada? And I believe strongly that expats are some of the strongest, for lack of a better word, nationalists that I've ever met. I remember once when we were in Riyadh, and every month the Canadian consulate used to have a tea night or something they'd call it. So, of course, there's no alcohol in Saudi Arabia, but the consulate could get some. So once a month we'd go to the consulate and have a party. And I remember one of the first time actually, we walked into the consulate and there was a huge, a 20-foot granite slab that said Canada on it that was there. And the woman beside me, Deborah, just broke out into tears because, Saudi's so different and you're really like great things, but just kind of embracing that Canadian part of it was just great to see that. And so all those Canadians got together once a month and that was great. So I think expats really are strong nationalists. And so coming back, it's just great to appreciate all the things that are in Canada again. But I can think of two things that I could comment on. Number one, I don't know that I've done such a good job of this, but I have made such powerful friends. And I remember in Saudi there once when the bombs hit, we had a family came and said, "Can we stay with you tonight? Because we don't feel safe in our compound." That's a powerful experience. Come in, and be here. And I don't think I've seen that family since. We moved away, and actually I did. I saw them in Singapore once. But just, it's hard. We're all over the place. And so making that effort to connect is important and hard. Whereas people here, they've grown up with each other and they have known each other it's easier for them. And then I think the second thing that just comes to mind that's just so important for international people is you've got to be fiscally responsible. I remember hearing, I don't know that I know this woman personally, but the story that she lived internationally and she lived great. She flew business class. She stayed in 5-star hotels. She really had a great lifestyle. But then when she retired from international teaching, she hadn't saved anything. And all of a sudden it's like, well, where's my pension? And all of a sudden she went from living this incredible life to being very poor and having to live back in America. And so I don't know that all international teachers are ready for being able to think of, especially when you're young, being able to be responsible enough to be putting that money aside as much as they're going to need. Because you just need to have that money ready, because if you don't, it can be a bit of a shock. And I worry about some international teachers that haven't really prepared themselves fiscally as well as they should have.
Yep, you got to read Andrew Hallam's book and follow his Facebook group for some tips there.
I'm glad you mentioned it, Audrey, because that made a big difference to us. We switched everything after we read his books and listened to him speak, and it's made a big difference.
Yeah, for sure. Good guy.
So you've hit so many topics that I would say to our listeners to go ahead and take Mark's wisdom and take a deeper dive by going through our podcast list, our blog, our resource list to go even deeper. And on the note of repatriation, we've done a whole show on it with our panel, and Audrey and I have spoken about our leaving international education as well. So there's a lot of information that's out there on that topic. All right, as we wind up, let's do a rapid fire as you think back to some of the main takeaways that you would like to share from your time as an international educator. Let's start with recruiting. What's one thing or two things you would say about recruiting, for example?
Do your homework. It's so easy to go recruiting and to always just look at, let's say you're a good teacher, couple, you get offered 5 different positions and just pick the one that offers the most money. Because you don't really know. I mean, everybody's trying to sell you and everything. It's really hard to tell. And so here's the one that offers us the most money. That's the one we'll go to. That's not always necessarily the best choice. So try to ask around, ask people who've been to these different schools. It's sometimes hard because they'll pressure you to make a decision, especially if you're at a recruiting fair. But do your homework when recruiting.
Okay, good advice. What about adjusting when you initially come to a new place?
It's a simple thing, but for me, live in the time zone you're in. I remember when we first went to the Philippines, we had jet lag and we were taking naps in the afternoon. And one of the experienced teachers came in right off the plane, went right to her classroom and started setting up her classroom. And we're like, aren't you tired? Yeah, but it's 3:00 in the afternoon. I'm going to start working. And it makes a big difference. Just live in the time zone you're in.
Would you intend to say that as well in terms of culturally and the whole shamir, like not just literally the time zone, but just really adapt?
Yeah, I think it's possible to go and live in places and live. Aramco seems to me like if you lived in Aramco, you'd be living in an American suburb in Saudi. For some people, that's fine. But some of the people that I've really admired have gone to these different cultural places and really embraced the best parts of those cultures. And I think that's part of why you're overseas, is to get these different cultural experiences and enrich your life. And I've really admired those people.
And that connects to community. So what's your advice about community?
It's just that I think when you're first going in, you're like all these different separate places. But there are different ways that you build a community within the community you're in. But then as you've been overseas, you just start expanding that community and you meet different people at these different fairs. Ear Coast needs, like, I know there's a number of people who we've taught at different schools because, I said, hey, come to our school, and, you get to meet them again. So it really does seem like the international schools is the whole world, but it is really amazing. You really can be an international community, and you really can keep a connection with people from all around different places. It's kind of neat.
So, to the extent you're comfortable blending in, meeting people from all sorts of different parts of the world and making community there, what about sort of the extent to which you're ambassador for your own
That's a great
country?
way of putting it. I love that you are an ambassador for your country. I mean, people watch CNN and they think that that's what the truth is. But if you come across and represent yourself and your country and different viewpoints, I think that's going to really make a difference. I think that international teachers are some of the best ambassadors around the world, especially with the children they teach. They're going to come across and say, hold it, that doesn't fit what I see on TV with the American teachers or the Canadian teachers I've had. So I love how you use the word ambassadors, because that's a great word for it.
And what are some lessons regarding the various people we meet that we work with, the local culture, and when we travel? What do you see some of the connections there?
Well, let me just tell a story. I mean, Saudi was such a different place. And I remember one day we had our two kids in a stroller, my wife and I, and we were at a shopping mall. And a man in his gucha and his Saudi wife in her abaya kind of walked right up to us. And I was like, oh, what's going to happen? And he came up and he knelt down and he held the hands of my children and he looked up at me and he said, you are a lucky man. And, you know, that whole sense of
Oh,
family, of having children and family, it just warmed my heart. And it just made me realize that in Saudi and in every place, that sense of having children and family is just so important. And I just met so many more good people that shared values that I have as well than ones that didn't in my international experience.
agreed. One of my biggest lessons learned is that people are more alike than they are different. And I really wish more people could gain that appreciation. That's just beautiful. What about some interactions that you had regarding, in a lot of these places where we've worked, there are workers, we'll call them blue collar workers, who are kind of imported from other countries. You had some thoughts
Yeah,
about
we're
that?
just not prepared for that. We that's something that's totally different for international educators than if you've been an educator back in your home country. You are the one who does all those things. Where it's one of the great reasons I have appreciated being overseas, because we had helpers who did a lot of the domestic work and allowed us to spend a lot more time with our children. The nighttime we read books with them while our helper cleaned up, and so they're just such vital parts. But it's a learning experience because we haven't had helpers. We're not used to that. It's not something we've grown up with. But probably more importantly, my wife and I always tried to make sure that whoever the helpers were, that we were always treating them with respect and kindness and trying to see how things were from their viewpoint and make life as good for them as we could.
That's so important. The validating of their dignity and trying to take their perspective. But it seems like it also gets into the line between one's culture and principles and belief system, and then where the culture that you're living within encroaches. What do you have to say about
Yeah, I
that
think it's
one?
a great point. I think it reminds me of when I was in China, and I remember, in Saudi, the men were the ones who drove, and so quite naturally, because they drove, they also did a lot of the shopping. And so we knew the grocery, we'd get together on a Friday night and we'd say, you know where you find the Tabasco sauce? And so all the men would be talking about what aisle different things were, and the women had a good
I
laugh at
love it.
us. But somehow that carried over, and I still do a lot of the grocery shopping. But it also did a lot of it when I was in Shanghai. And I remember I'd be going in the grocery cart and I'd be pushing along, and different people would come along, Chinese, would actually reach into my cart, take a look at what I'd bought, and then put it back. And I asked some people, what are they doing? They said, they're just curious. What would Westerners buy? And so they had no problems of going in and were just kind of curious at what kind of things Westerners bought at Carrefour or Jolly Food, which was the local supermarket. And so those kind of cultural things, you smile at and just, oh, okay, that's learning something different and just kind of fun.
That's interesting, and that is a takeaway to have in your mind as well. So one of the big things for folks as they look at the criteria when they're looking at schools, big picture is the government, is the system of how things work. Does it fit well enough with your value system? Because there are going to be cases where it won't, and you're going to be very uncomfortable, and that might not be a good fit. So I'll just add that in.
Mark, you've given us so much information here, and it was just really rich. And I love that as you're thinking of different examples of things, you're jumping around from Saudi to Manila to China. And it just was really fun for me to observe that and the way that your experiences kind of transcends space and time. So I really enjoyed that. Is there anything else you'd like to share
I think
before
I'd
we
like
wrap
to
up?
end on, my wife and I taught in Canada for 6 years, and we could have carried on. And I think it would have also given us incredible, great experiences, and that would have also been a really good path to have taken. Some of our friends took that path, and they've had a great life. But I know for us, I remember thinking, when I'm done, I would kind of like to have chapters and kind of be able to look back and say, here's my Philippine chapter, and then here's my Saudi chapter, and here's my Shanghai chapter. Because I think that would be a really enriching way to look back on my career and my life, is to have such interesting different chapters in my life, rather than kind of a melding of being in one district in one place. And yeah, that wasn't for me. I wanted something a little bit more contrasting, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more risky, a little bit more unknown, just because I think that makes for a more interesting novel of one's life. And now that I'm here at retirement and I can look back on, was that the right way to go? I can honestly say yes. I'm glad I did that. I do think I've got some chapters I can look back on and different experiences, and I think I like the novel my life is written, and it's interesting, and I'm glad we made the choice to be international. It's been a great experience.
So, Mark, how can people follow you if you're out there on social networking like LinkedIn or something like that?
I do have a LinkedIn account, but being not overseas and international so much anymore, I'm not as active on it. But I'm happy if anybody would like to follow up on anything.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this trip around the world and really enjoyed it and so much appreciate your time.
Thank you
Thanks
guys. And
again, Mark.
again, I've listened to some of your podcasts now, and boy, I wish I would have had this podcast when I was starting off. You've got some really great stuff there.
Thanks, Mark, and best wishes to you and your family.
Thanks. You guys too.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.